A 37-year-old philosophy professor seduced his student, got her pregnant, and married her in secret. Then her uncle hired thugs to break into his bedroom and castrate him while he slept. But that horrifying night of violence wasn't the end of their love story. It was just the beginning. The letters they exchanged after this brutal attack would become the most influential writings on romantic love in Western history. Yet almost no one knows the real story behind these letters, the philosophical debates, the religious controversy, and the question that haunted them both: was their love a gift from God, or a sin that destroyed them? Tonight we're uncovering this medieval scandal. Hey, welcome back. If you're new here, this is where we dive deep into history's most fascinating, untold stories. Tonight's tale is perfect for bedtime. It's got philosophy, forbidden romance, and medieval drama. Get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe grab some tea. And if this story grabs you like I think it will, hit that subscribe button. I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Are you in bed already? Walking the dog? I love hearing from you. Alright, let's go back nearly 1,000 years to a city that was about to change everything. A city engulfed in learning. Picture Paris in 1115. Not the Paris you know, this is medieval Paris. Narrow, muddy streets. The smell of horses and unwashed bodies. But something incredible is happening here that's never happened before. This city is becoming the intellectual centre of Europe. Scholars are pouring in from England, Germany, Italy, all drawn by something revolutionary. The cathedral schools. These aren't just religious institutions anymore. They're debate halls where the brightest minds are asking dangerous questions about God, about reason, about everything the Church has taught for centuries. And at the heart of this intellectual revolution, a man who's about to become infamous. The Catholic Church controls everything in 1115, every aspect of life. Who you marry, what you think, what questions you're allowed to ask. But these cathedral schools, they're creating something new. Scholasticism, they call it. Using logic and reason to understand God and Scripture. Think about how radical that is. For centuries, faith was enough. Now scholars are saying, wait, let's think about this. Let's debate. Let's use our minds to get closer to divine truth. The Church is nervous. Some bishops love it. Others think it's dangerous. And right in the middle of this tension, a young nobleman from Brittany, who's about to turn everything upside down, Peter Abelard, born around 1079, noble family, could have inherited lands, lived comfortably as a knight. Instead, he walked away from everything to pursue philosophy and theology. By his mid-30s, he's the most famous teacher in Paris. Students travel hundreds of miles just to hear him lecture. Why? Because Abelard doesn't just teach, he performs. Imagine a medieval TED Talk crossed with a roast battle. He'd demolish opponents in public debates with devastating wit. Other scholars were terrified to face him. Students packed lecture halls like he was a rock star. And Abelard, he loved every minute of the attention. Here's what made Abelard dangerous to the establishment. He didn't just accept authority. If a church father said something, Abelard would ask, "But why? Prove it to me. Use logic." His method was simple but revolutionary. Collect contradictory statements from religious authorities, then use reason to resolve the contradictions. Sounds boring. It wasn't. These debates drew crowds. They were entertainment, intellectual blood sport. Abelard would quote Augustine, then Jerome, then Aristotle, show where they disagreed, then use pure logic to find the truth. Other teachers hated him, students worshipped him, the church. They weren't sure what to do with him. But there's a problem brewing in paradise. The church expects clerics like Abelard to remain celibate. No distractions from the higher life of the mind. Marriage, discouraged for intellectuals. It pulls you away from pure philosophical pursuit. Women, especially educated women, are viewed with suspicion. They're seen as temptation incarnate. And here's the tension that's building. All these brilliant men gathering in Paris, debating the nature of love and desire from a purely theoretical standpoint. What happens when theory meets reality? When the philosopher who lectures about controlling earthly desires suddenly can't? That's where our story gets interesting and dangerous. The intellectual atmosphere in Paris is unlike anything Europe has seen. Students sleep on the streets because there aren't enough rooms. They debate in taverns until dawn. Philosophy is becoming popular culture. Abelard's love songs, yes, he writes love songs between lectures, are sung throughout the city. Most people don't realize they're about a real woman. The energy is intoxicating. Knowledge feels revolutionary. For the first time in centuries, European minds are truly free to question, to explore, to push boundaries. And Abelard is the undisputed king of this intellectual revolution. Charismatic, brilliant, arrogant, he believes his mind can solve any problem, including, as he's about to discover, the problem of love. There's something intoxicating about this moment in history. For centuries, Europe has been intellectually sleepy. The Dark Ages, right? But Paris in 1115 feels like ancient Athens reborn. Philosophers debating under cathedral spires instead of olive trees. And the debates aren't just academic anymore. They're about real life, about marriage versus celibacy, about whether reason can coexist with faith, about whether human desire is God's gift or Satan's trap. These aren't abstract questions when you're a 37-year-old man who spent his life in books and suddenly realizes he's never experienced the thing he spent years theorizing about: love, desire, the human heart versus the enlightened mind. Abelard thinks he has it all figured out. He's the master of dialectics, the art of logical argument. Present thesis, present antithesis, use reason to find synthesis, truth through debate. He's applied this method to theology, to ethics, to every philosophical problem he's encountered. And it's worked. He's famous across Europe for his intellectual victories. But here's what Abelard doesn't realize yet. Some problems can't be solved through logic alone. Some forces are stronger than reason, and one of those forces is about to walk into his perfectly ordered intellectual life and turn everything into chaos. Her name is Heloise, and she's about to teach the great philosopher a lesson he never expected. The cathedral schools are buzzing with rumours about a remarkable young woman, fluent in Latin, Greek and Hebrew, educated by nuns at Argenteuil, known throughout Paris for her brilliance. She's about 17 years old, living with her uncle Fulbert, who's a canon at Notre Dame Cathedral. Her name is Heloise d'Argenteuil, and here's what makes her extraordinary for her time. She's not just educated, she's intellectually fearless. She debates theology with grown men and wins. She reads philosophy, not because she has to, but because she loves it. In an age when most women can't read at all, Heloise is fluent in 3 languages and hungry for more knowledge. When Abelard first hears about Heloise, he's curious. Another intellectual to spar with. Interesting. But then he meets her, and everything changes. She's not just brilliant, she challenges him in ways no student ever has. She asks questions he hasn't considered. She finds holes in his arguments. She makes him think differently about problems he thought he'd solved. And there's something else. Something Abelard, for all his intellectual sophistication, isn't prepared for. The way she looks at him when he explains a complex philosophical point. The way she smiles when she catches him in a logical inconsistency. The way his heart races when their hands accidentally brush reaching for the same manuscript. Abelard starts finding excuses to visit Fulbert's house. Intellectual discussions, of course. Nothing inappropriate. He's a respected teacher. She's his colleague's niece. They talk about Augustine's Confessions, about Aristotle's logic, about whether Plato was right that love of wisdom is the highest form of love. But underneath these scholarly conversations, Something else is building, tension, attraction, the kind of chemistry that makes every interaction electric. Abelard tells himself it's just intellectual admiration. Heloise probably thinks the same thing, but both of them are lying to themselves. And in medieval Paris, that kind of lie can have devastating consequences, especially when the woman's uncle is a powerful church official. Here's what makes this story so compelling. We're not just talking about medieval romance, we're watching two of the brightest minds in Europe discover something that all their education hasn't prepared them for. The collision between reason and desire, between everything they've been taught about proper behaviour and what their hearts are actually feeling. Abelard has built his entire reputation on the power of logic over emotion. Heloise has been raised to believe that spiritual love is higher than earthly love. But when two brilliant people connect, intellectually and emotionally and physically, all those theories start to crumble. And crumbling theories in medieval Paris, that's not just personal drama, that's dangerous. The stage is set for one of history's most passionate and tragic love affairs. Paris is buzzing with intellectual energy. The church is nervous about all this questioning and reasoning. Abelard is at the height of his fame and influence. Heloise is hungry for knowledge and unafraid of challenging authority. Her uncle Fulbert thinks his brilliant niece might benefit from having the most famous teacher in Paris as her tutor. And Abelard, he's about to make a decision that will change both their lives forever. He's going to deliberately arrange to become Heloise's private tutor. Living in the same house, teaching her every day. What could possibly go wrong? Everything is about to change. The great philosopher who spent his life mastering logic and reason is about to discover that some forces are stronger than intellect. The brilliant young woman who's devoted her life to learning is about to learn something they don't teach in books. And the religious world that's tried to separate mind from body, sacred from earthly, is about to witness what happens when those boundaries collapse. This is the story of Abelard and Heloise, a story about love and learning, passion and punishment, letters that would influence Western culture for 1,000 years, and a night of violence that would change everything. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to talk about how a tutoring arrangement became the scandal of medieval Europe. An improbable prodigy, Heloise. Picture a 17-year-old girl in 1115 Paris who could debate theology in Latin, read ancient philosophy in Greek, and study scripture in Hebrew. While most women her age were learning to spin wool and manage households, Heloise d'Argentel was writing philosophical treatises that impressed the smartest men in Europe. She lived in her uncle's house near Notre Dame Cathedral, surrounded by books instead of marriage prospects. This wasn't normal, this was revolutionary, and it was about to change everything. Her uncle Fulbert was a canon at Notre Dame, which meant he had access to the cathedral's library, one of the best collections of manuscripts in medieval Europe. But here's the thing that made Heloise extraordinary. Most scholars of this era knew Latin. The really good ones knew Greek too, but Hebrew, that was almost unheard of, especially for a woman. Heloise didn't just know Hebrew, she was fluent. She could read Talmudic commentaries, rabbinic texts, original biblical manuscripts. At 17, think about that. She'd been educated at the convent of Argentil since childhood. Now, convent education for girls usually meant basic reading, some Latin prayers, maybe simple arithmetic, but Argentil was different. The nuns there had maintained a tradition of serious scholarship dating back centuries. They had manuscripts most monasteries would kill for, and they saw something special in young Heloise, so they taught her everything: logic, rhetoric, dialectic, the full program that only boys usually received. She absorbed it all like a sponge. By age 17, scholars throughout Paris knew her name. Not because she was beautiful, though contemporary accounts suggest she was. Not because of her family connections, though Uncle Fulbert's position helped. They knew her because she was brilliant. Genuinely, undeniably brilliant. She could hold her own in philosophical debates with men twice her age. She wrote letters in perfect Latin that circulated among intellectuals like underground manuscripts. In an era when most people couldn't read at all, Heloise was writing original philosophy. This level of female education was almost scandalous. The church had mixed feelings about educated women. On one hand, they needed literate nuns to copy manuscripts and teach girls basic skills. On the other hand, too much learning in women was seen as dangerous. It challenged the natural order, made them harder to control, made them ask uncomfortable questions about scripture, about doctrine, about why women couldn't be priests if they were just as smart as men. Heloise was walking a tightrope she didn't even know existed. Living with Uncle Fulbert gave her unusual freedom. Most 17-year-old girls from noble families were either married off or locked away in convents by now. But Fulbert was proud of his brilliant niece. He showed her off to his clerical colleagues, let important visitors debate philosophy with her over dinner. She was like his prized possession, a living demonstration of what education could accomplish. He had no idea he was creating a problem that would soon explode in all their faces. What made Heloise truly dangerous wasn't just her intelligence. It was her independence of thought. She didn't just memorize what the church fathers had written. She questioned them, challenged their logic, found inconsistencies in their arguments. She wrote commentaries on Augustine and Jerome that pointed out philosophical flaws these men had missed for centuries. Imagine being a medieval church official and having a teenage girl explain why your theological heroes were wrong about certain points. It was thrilling and terrifying. Word of this remarkable young woman eventually reached Peter Abelard. Now, Abelard was already the most famous philosopher in Paris at 37. Students travelled from across Europe to hear him lecture. Kings sought his counsel. He'd made his reputation by demolishing older philosophers in public debates, proving their arguments were full of holes. So when he heard about a 17-year-old girl who could debate theology in 3 ancient languages, his interest was piqued, but probably not for the reasons you'd expect. Abelard later admitted in his autobiography that he deliberately sought Heloise out, not because he was romantically interested, at least not at first. He was intellectually curious. Here was someone who might actually challenge him, make him think harder, push his ideas further. Most of his students were intimidated by his reputation. They nodded along, took notes, rarely questioned anything. But a brilliant woman with nothing to lose and everything to prove, that was different, that was interesting, that was potentially dangerous. The tutorial arrangement Abelard proposed to Fulbert seemed innocent enough. He offered to take lodging in Fulbert's house and provide private instruction to Heloise in exchange for room and board. This was actually a great deal for Fulbert, getting Paris's most famous teacher as a live-in tutor for his niece. For free, he jumped at the chance. What he didn't realize was that Abelard had been planning this for weeks. This wasn't a spontaneous offer. This was a calculated move by a master strategist. Their first meeting, well, Abelard describes it as electric, not romantic electricity, but intellectual lightning. Here was a student who could actually keep up with him. When he quoted Aristotle, she quoted it back in the original Greek and pointed out translation errors in the Latin version. When he cited Jerome, she countered with Augustine. When he made a logical argument, she found the flaw and dismantled it piece by piece. For the first time in years, Abelard felt challenged. He loved it. The lessons began formally enough. Ancient rhetoric, Platonic philosophy, biblical exegesis. But something unusual was happening. Instead of Abelard lecturing and Heloise taking notes, they were having actual conversations, debates, arguments that lasted for hours. She wasn't just learning from him, she was teaching him too, showing him perspectives he'd never considered, asking questions that made him rethink positions he'd held for decades. This wasn't a normal student-teacher relationship. this was a meeting of intellectual equals. Uncle Fulbert noticed the change in both of them. His niece was more animated, more confident, spending hours preparing for her daily lessons with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. And Abelard, the great philosopher, seemed different, more engaged, more alive. He'd arrive early for lessons and stay late into the evening, long after the formal instruction was supposed to end. They'd sit by the fire, debating ethics and theology, while Fulbert dozed in his chair, unaware that something profound was developing right under his nose. By medieval standards, this situation was already pushing boundaries. A 37-year-old man spending hours alone with a 17-year-old girl, even for educational purposes, it raised eyebrows. But Abelard was a respected cleric. Heloise was under her uncle's protection, and the intellectual benefits were obvious to everyone. Still, servants gossiped. Neighbours noticed. Other clerics whispered. The intensity of their scholarly discussions was becoming the subject of speculation throughout the cathedral quarter. Something had to give. The problem wasn't just social propriety. It was the nature of medieval education itself. The relationship between master and student was supposed to be hierarchical, formal, distant, but Abelard and Heloise had blown past those boundaries. They were intellectual partners now, equals engaged in the pursuit of truth. And when two brilliant minds connect like that, when they're spending hours together every day, when they're challenging each other, inspiring each other, completing each other's thoughts, well, other kinds of chemistry tend to develop. The stage was set for disaster. A brilliant young woman hungry for knowledge, an older man intoxicated by finally finding his intellectual equal, a guardian who trusted both of them completely, and a society that had no framework for handling a relationship that defied every category they understood. Teacher and student, master and pupil, man and woman, adult and teenager, sacred and secular. The boundaries were blurring, and in medieval Paris, when boundaries blurred, people got hurt, sometimes permanently. The intricate web of passion and philosophy. Abelard had a plan, not just any plan, a calculated seduction disguised as academic pursuit. He'd heard about this brilliant young woman living with her uncle Fulbert, Heloise d'Argenteau, 17 years old and already famous throughout Paris for her mind, fluent in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, the kind of intellectual equal Abelard had never encountered. So he approached Fulbert with an offer. Let me tutor your niece. I'll even pay you rent to live in your house. Fulbert jumped at the chance to have Paris's most celebrated philosopher as a private teacher. Looking back, Abelard admitted his motives were anything but pure. In his own words, he thought so little of himself as a lover that he believed he had only to make a suggestion for it to be accepted. Arrogant? Absolutely. But here's the thing. Abelard wasn't wrong about his appeal. He was 37, at the peak of his intellectual powers, magnetic, famous. Students travelled across Europe just to hear him lecture. And now he'd positioned himself as the private tutor to the most brilliant young woman in Paris. What could possibly go wrong? Their first lesson changed everything. Heloise wasn't just brilliant, she was fearless. She challenged Abelard's interpretations of Aristotle, questioned his theological arguments, pushed back on his philosophical assumptions. For a man used to intellectual dominance, this was intoxicating. Here was someone who could actually keep up with him, who could debate ethics and metaphysics without missing a beat. Abelard later confessed that within days he was more interested in the teacher than the teaching. The attraction was immediate, intense, and completely mutual. The shift happened gradually, then all at once. Philosophical debates that started in the morning stretched late into the evening. Heloise would lean forward during discussions, her eyes bright with intellectual excitement. Abelard found himself stealing glances at her hands as she gestured, the curve of her neck when she bent over manuscripts. The space between teacher and student was shrinking. Every shared insight, every moment of intellectual connection was building something dangerous, something that had nothing to do with Aristotle and everything to do with desire. Then it happened. Abelard later wrote about it with startling honesty. They were united first in the dwelling that sheltered their love, then in hearts that burned with it. Under the pretense of study, they spent hours in the happiness of love. Learning held out secret opportunities that passion craved. Think about that for a second. The most famous philosopher in Paris, a man sworn to celibacy, was conducting a secret affair with his 17-year-old student in her uncle's house, while her uncle paid him to be there. Their study sessions became elaborate performances, books open on the table, scholarly discussions for anyone who might overhear, but underneath, stolen kisses between translations of Greek texts, hands touching while pointing out passages, whispered confessions of love disguised as theological debates. Heloise was as skilled at this deception as Abelard, maybe more so. She had to be. One wrong word, one suspicious glance from Fulbert, and everything would collapse. The stakes for her were infinitely higher than they were for him. Abelard couldn't contain his happiness. He started writing songs, love songs, about Heloise, though he never used her name. These weren't private poems tucked away in his room. These were public performances, sung by troubadours, hummed in taverns across Paris. Abelard later admitted his songs were on everyone's lips because love gave him inspiration like never before. Here's what gets me about this. The man was so intoxicated by love that he couldn't help but broadcast it to the entire city. Paris started talking. Who was the mystery woman inspiring Abelard's sudden burst of romantic poetry? People were connecting dots. The great philosopher had moved in with Canon Fulbert. Fulbert had a beautiful, brilliant niece. Abelard's songs were suspiciously specific, descriptions that seemed too real to be fictional. Whispers in the cathedral schools, knowing looks exchanged at lectures. But Fulbert remained oblivious. Or maybe he didn't want to see what was happening under his own roof. Sometimes willful blindness feels safer than confronting an impossible truth. What made their connection so powerful wasn't just physical attraction. It was intellectual intimacy. Heloise challenged Abelard in ways no one else dared. She'd argue that his interpretation of Augustine was flawed, question whether his logical proofs actually proved anything, push him to defend positions he'd taken for granted. For Abelard, used to students who hung on his every word, this was revolutionary. Here was someone who saw him as an equal, not an authority figure to worship. Heloise had her own philosophical insights that were reshaping Abelard's thinking. She'd argue that intention mattered more than action in determining sin, that love itself couldn't be evil if it was pure in motive. These weren't just abstract debates. They were laying groundwork for ideas that would influence Abelard's later masterwork on ethics. But in the moment, these discussions were foreplay, intellectual seduction that was as intoxicating as physical touch. Maybe more so. When minds connect that deeply, everything else follows. Their passion was consuming everything. Abelard's lectures suffered because he was distracted, thinking about Heloise instead of theology. Students noticed their famous teacher seemed distant, unfocused. Meanwhile, Heloise was growing bolder, initiating conversations about love in literature, finding reasons to brush against Abelard during lessons, looking at him with an intensity that should have terrified him, should have made him end this before it went too far. Instead, it only pulled him deeper. They were both drowning, and neither wanted to be saved. They started taking risks that were absolutely insane. Meeting in gardens outside the city walls, stealing moments alone in the cathedral library after dark. Abelard would cancel public lectures to spend entire days with Heloise, claiming illness. They were behaving like teenagers, not a respected philosopher and his student. Love had made them reckless, made them believe they were invisible, that somehow the normal rules didn't apply to them. that their connection was so special, so pure, that it justified any risk. Then Heloise started feeling sick in the mornings. At first she dismissed it, too much studying late into the night, the stress of keeping their relationship secret, but the nausea persisted. Her monthly cycle stopped. She was exhausted in ways that felt different, deeper. There was a moment, she later described it as sudden, terrifying clarity, standing in Fulbert's garden, watching Abelard approach for another stolen afternoon together, when she realized their affair had created something irreversible, something that would change everything. The pregnancy test in medieval times was waiting and watching. Heloise counted days, then weeks, felt the subtle changes in her body that confirmed her worst fears. She was 17, unmarried, living with her guardian uncle, secretly pregnant by her teacher, a teacher who was sworn to celibacy, a man whose career would be destroyed if this came to light. But here's what's remarkable about Heloise. Even facing social destruction, her first concern wasn't for herself, it was for Abelard, for what this would mean for the man she loved. She had to tell him. There was no hiding this forever, no way to make it disappear. So one evening, during what Fulbert thought was a routine tutoring session, Heloise looked at Abelard and said the words that would shatter both their worlds. "I'm pregnant." Abelard later wrote that the news hit him like a physical blow. All his careful planning, his calculated seduction, his brilliant philosophical mind, none of it had prepared him for this moment, for the reality that their passion had consequences neither of them was ready to face. They sat in stunned silence, books scattered around them, like evidence of the innocent relationship this was supposed to be. Everything was about to change. Abelard's reputation, his position at Notre Dame, his standing in the church, Heloise's future, her safety, her very survival, and growing inside her, completely unaware of the chaos it would unleash, was the child who would be named Astrolabe, their son, the living proof that the most celebrated philosopher in Paris had broken his vows for love. The question now wasn't whether they'd be discovered. It was what they'd do when they were love, duty, and a secret marriage. Heloise is pregnant. In 12th century Paris, this isn't just scandalous, it's catastrophic. An unmarried woman carrying the child of her tutor. Uncle Fulbert is beyond furious. He's talking about family honour, about revenge, about what happens to men who seduce young women under their protection. Abelard knows he's in serious danger, so he does what medieval men do when they've gotten themselves into impossible situations. He proposes marriage. Problem solved, right? Not quite. Because Heloise? She says no. Think about this for a second. A pregnant, unmarried teenager in medieval France is rejecting marriage to the father of her child. The same man who could legitimize her situation and save her from complete social ruin. But Heloise isn't thinking like other women of her time. She's thinking like a philosopher, and what she says next will blow your mind. She argues that marriage would actually destroy both of them, that true love and legal marriage are incompatible, that brilliant men shouldn't be trapped by domestic obligations. Heloise pulls out every philosophical argument she can think of. She quotes Cicero, Jerome, even St. Paul. She tells Abelard that the greatest thinkers in history stayed unmarried, that wives distract philosophers from their higher calling, that crying babies and household duties kill intellectual creativity. But here's what's really revolutionary. She's not just protecting him, she's protecting herself too. As an unmarried woman, she has some freedom. As a wife, she becomes property. Her brilliant mind gets reduced to household management and childbearing. This philosophical debate between them goes on for weeks. Abelard keeps insisting marriage is the only honourable solution. Heloise keeps arguing it's intellectual suicide. She writes to him, and these aren't love letters begging him to stay. They're sophisticated theological arguments about why marriage corrupts pure love. She argues that when you legalise passion, you kill it. that true devotion can't be commanded by law or ceremony. This woman is deconstructing the entire institution of marriage while pregnant in 1117. What makes Heloise's position even more remarkable is her concern for Abelard's career. She knows that married clerics face suspicion from church authorities, that domestic responsibilities would interfere with his teaching and writing. She's willing to sacrifice her own social standing to preserve his intellectual legacy, but she's also being brutally honest about medieval marriage. She knows that once she becomes his wife, her opinions stop mattering, her philosophical voice gets silenced. So she's choosing intellectual partnership over legal protection. Meanwhile, Fulbert is getting more dangerous by the day. He's spreading word around Paris about what Abelard did to his niece. He's talking about family honour and medieval justice. And Abelard realises that philosophy debates won't save him from Fulbert's rage. So he makes an executive decision. He arranges a secret marriage ceremony, not because he's won the argument with Heloise, but because he thinks it might save both their lives. Heloise finally agrees, but she makes it clear she's doing this under protest. The secret wedding happens at dawn. Just a few witnesses, no celebration, no announcement. Heloise later describes it as the worst day of her life, not because she doesn't love Abelard, but because she believes they're destroying something pure and perfect. She sees marriage as a cage that will transform their intellectual equals into traditional husband and wife roles. And in medieval society, she's probably right. Most married women disappear from historical records completely. Their voices get absorbed into their husbands' stories. Here's where things get complicated. Abelard thinks the secret marriage will calm Fulbert down, that knowing Heloise is legitimately married will restore the family's honour. But Fulbert doesn't see it that way. A secret marriage, that's almost worse than no marriage at all. It looks like Abelard is ashamed of Heloise, like he's trying to hide the relationship while still claiming legal rights to her. Fulbert interprets this as the ultimate insult. His rage isn't cooling down, it's building. The secrecy that was supposed to protect everyone starts tearing them apart. Fulbert begins dropping hints around Paris that his niece is actually married to the famous philosopher, but he's doing it in a way that makes Abelard look dishonourable, like he seduced an innocent girl and then tried to hide behind a secret ceremony. The gossip spreads through the cathedral schools. Students start whispering. Other clerics start asking questions. The secret isn't protecting anyone anymore. Heloise finds herself in an impossible position. Publicly, she has to deny the marriage to protect Abelard from scandal. Privately, she's legally bound to him, but still living with her increasingly unstable uncle. She can't claim the protections of being a wife without destroying Abelard's career. She can't return to being Fulbert's unmarried niece, because she's not. And meanwhile, their son Astrolabe is being raised by Abelard's family in Brittany, hidden like another shameful secret. Fulbert's behaviour becomes erratic and threatening. Sometimes he acts like nothing happened. Sometimes he explodes into rage about family dishonour. He starts making comments about medieval justice and what happens to men who seduce young women. Heloise realises she's living with a man who might actually be planning violence. But where can she go? She's caught between two worlds, neither fully a wife nor fully a daughter. The secret marriage has created a legal and social nightmare. The tension finally breaks when Fulbert starts publicly revealing the marriage, while simultaneously denying it. He tells some people that Heloise is married to restore family honour. Then he tells others she's not married to make Abelard look like a seducer. He's using the truth and lies as weapons, trying to destroy Abelard's reputation either way. And it's working. The contradictory stories are spreading confusion and scandal throughout Paris. Abelard realises he's losing control of the narrative completely. Desperate to protect Heloise from her uncle's increasingly dangerous behaviour, Abelard makes another fateful decision. He secretly removes her from Fulbert's house and takes her to the convent at Argenteuil, the same place where she was educated as a child. It's meant to be temporary protection, a safe place where Fulbert can't hurt her while they figure out what to do next. But to Fulbert, this looks like Abelard is forcing his wife into religious life to get rid of her. Fulbert interprets Heloise's removal to the convent as the ultimate betrayal. In his mind, Abelard has seduced his niece, married her in secret to avoid scandal, then dumped her in a nunnery when she became inconvenient. Medieval honour culture demands blood for this level of insult. Fulbert isn't just angry anymore, he's planning revenge. And in 12th century Paris, when powerful men want revenge on someone who's dishonoured their family, they don't file lawsuits, they hire thugs. The secret marriage that was supposed to solve everything has created a disaster. Heloise is hidden away in a convent, separated from both her husband and her child. Abelard is trying to teach and maintain his reputation, while rumours swirl around Paris. Fulbert is consumed with rage and planning something terrible, and the philosophical debates about love and marriage that seemed so important, they're about to become irrelevant, because medieval justice doesn't care about intellectual arguments, it cares about blood and honour. What happens next will change both their lives forever. Fulbert's thirst for revenge is about to collide with one of the most brutal acts of violence in medieval academic history. The secret marriage that was meant to protect them will become the very thing that destroys Abelard's body and transforms their love story into legend. Because sometimes, trying to do the right thing in impossible circumstances leads to consequences no one could have imagined. Fulbert is about to make sure Abelard pays the ultimate price for what he's done. The fury of honour. The secret marriage should have solved everything. Should have, but secrets in medieval Paris, they don't stay buried long, especially when you're the most famous philosopher in the city and you've just married your 17-year-old student. Fulbert knew, of course he knew, and what started as whispered gossip in cathedral corridors was about to explode into something much worse. Something that would leave blood on the stones and change everything forever. This is where their love story takes its darkest turn. Fulbert was losing his mind. His precious niece, his ward, the girl he'd raised, married in secret to her teacher. A man twice her age. The shame was eating him alive. Every time he walked through Notre Dame, he felt the stares, the whispers. Canon Fulbert couldn't even protect his own family's honour. And Abelard was still teaching, still drawing crowds, still acting like nothing had changed, like he hadn't just destroyed the reputation of one of Notre Dame's most respected clerics. The marriage was supposed to be private. Abelard had agreed to marry Heloise, only to appease her uncle, to restore some dignity to the situation. But Fulbert couldn't leave it alone. He started talking, dropped hints to colleagues, mentioned it in conversations. Soon, half of Paris knew that the great philosopher Peter Abelard had secretly married his student. And you know what? That made everything worse, because now it looked like Abelard was ashamed of his own wife. Heloise was caught in the middle of this mess. Her uncle was publicly humiliating her by spreading news of the marriage. Students and clerics stared at her differently now, some with pity, others with disgust. The brilliant young woman who'd once commanded respect for her intellect was now just the professor's secret wife. The scandal was growing. Abelard's career was in jeopardy. Their love, their beautiful, impossible love, was becoming Paris's favourite piece of gossip. That's when Abelard made the decision that would seal their fate. He had to protect Heloise from the scandal, from her uncle's rage, from the growing whispers. There was only one place in medieval Paris where a woman could be completely safe from male interference: the convent. So he made arrangements with the Abbey of Argenteuil, where Heloise had been educated as a child. She would take temporary refuge there, just until things calmed down, just until Fulbert came to his senses. Heloise didn't want to go. Of course she didn't. She'd fought against their marriage in the first place, arguing it would hurt Abelard's career. Now she was being sent away like some shameful secret. but she loved Abelard too much to refuse. If hiding in a convent would protect him, protect them both, she'd do it. So she put on the rough brown habit of a novice nun and disappeared behind the walls of Argenteau, Paris's most brilliant woman, reduced to silence. Fulbert watched his niece disappear into the convent, and something snapped. This wasn't protection. This wasn't temporary. Abelard was getting rid of her, making her a nun, forcing her into religious life to clean up his mess. The bastard had seduced Fulbert's ward, gotten her pregnant, married her in secret, and now he was throwing her away, making her pay the price for his lust. In Fulbert's mind, this was the ultimate betrayal, the final insult. The rage that had been building in Fulbert's chest for months finally found its target. This wasn't about honour anymore. This wasn't about family reputation. This was about revenge, pure medieval revenge, and Fulbert knew exactly what that looked like in 12th century Paris. You didn't just hurt a man's career or reputation, you hurt his body. You made sure everyone knew what happened to men who dishonoured noble families. You made an example that would never be forgotten. Fulbert had connections, money, influence, and he used all of it to hire men who specialised in the kind of justice the courts wouldn't provide. Professional thugs, men who understood that sometimes honour required blood. The plan was simple, brutal, and perfectly medieval. They would wait until Abelard was alone, vulnerable, sleeping. Then they would take from him the thing that had caused all this trouble in the first place, his manhood, his ability to seduce and destroy innocent women. The night came in the summer of 1118. Abelard was sleeping in his chamber, probably dreaming of Heloise, probably planning how to get her out of that convent. He had no idea what was coming. No idea that Fulbert's men were already in the building, moving through the darkness with knives and ropes. No idea that his uncle-in-law had decided that public humiliation wasn't enough, that only physical mutilation would satisfy this particular debt of honour. They held him down. Can you imagine? The most famous intellectual in Paris, the man whose words could fill cathedrals, reduced to screaming in the dark. They castrated him with surgical precision. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated punishment, designed to strip him of everything that made him dangerous to other men's daughters. His reputation, his pride, his very identity as a man, all carved away in one horrible moment. When it was over, they left him bleeding and broken. The news hit Paris like a thunderclap. Peter Abelard, the great philosopher, the teacher whose lectures packed the cathedral schools, castrated in his own bed. The details spread through the city faster than fire. Some people were horrified, others whispered that he'd gotten what he deserved, but everyone understood the message Fulbert had sent. This is what happens when you dishonour a noble family. This is the price of forbidden love in medieval Paris. The physical trauma was only part of it. The shame, that's what really destroyed Abelard. In a culture that equated masculinity with intellectual authority, castration didn't just rob him of his manhood, it undermined everything he'd built. How could students respect a teacher who'd been so brutally humiliated? How could he stand before crowds and debate theology when everyone knew what had been taken from him? The great Abelard was broken in every way that mattered. Within days, Abelard made a decision that shocked even his enemies. He would become a monk, not out of religious calling, but out of shame so deep it felt like drowning. He entered the Abbey of Saint Denis, trading his scholar's robes for the rough brown habit of a Benedictine. The man who'd once commanded the intellectual life of Paris was now just another broken monk, hiding behind monastery walls. His teaching days were over, and Heloise, still at the convent, still believing this was temporary, still waiting for word that it was safe to come home. Instead, she received a message that shattered her world. Abelard was commanding her to take permanent vows to become a nun forever, not because God had called her, but because her husband, Her castrated, broken husband needed her to disappear completely, to become as dead to the world as he now was. She obeyed. What choice did she have? At 19 years old, Heloise took vows that would bind her to religious life forever, not out of faith, but out of love. Because even after everything, the scandal, the violence, the brutal destruction of their dreams, she still loved the man who just asked her to sacrifice her entire future for his wounded pride. Their passionate love affair was officially over. Their real story was just beginning. The path of penance and separation. After that brutal night, everything changes. Abelard's world collapses completely, physically, emotionally, spiritually. The man who once commanded lecture halls filled with brilliant students can barely look at himself in a mirror. The trauma runs deeper than the physical wound. His identity as a philosopher, as a lover, as a man, all of it shattered. And here's what gets me about this moment. He doesn't just retreat quietly. He makes the most dramatic choice possible. He's going to become a monk. Saint Denis Abbey. Picture this ancient monastery just outside Paris. Thick stone walls, endless corridors, the sound of prayers echoing at all hours. This is where Abelard runs to hide from the world. But here's the thing about trauma. You can change your clothes, shave your head, take vows of silence, but you can't outrun what happened to you. The nightmares follow him into those cold monastery cells. The shame burns just as hot under rough wool robes as it did in silk scholars' clothes. And Heloise, this breaks my heart. She's not even 20 years old, and Abelard tells her she has to become a nun too. Not because she feels called to religious life, but because he says so. Think about that for a second. The woman who once debated philosophy with the greatest minds in Paris, who challenged marriage itself on intellectual grounds, now she's being ordered into a convent like she's just another chess piece being moved around the board by men. She goes to Argenteuil, the same convent where she was educated as a child. But this time, she's not a brilliant student with unlimited potential. She's a wife in exile, a mother separated from her baby son, a woman whose entire future just got decided for her. The other nuns probably whisper about her, the fallen woman who seduced the great philosopher. Heloise hears every whisper, feels every sideways glance, and she takes her vows anyway, because Abelard asked her to. Here's what's devastating about their separation. They don't just lose each other physically, they lose their intellectual partnership. For years they had been each other's greatest teacher, greatest challenger, greatest inspiration. Abelard's philosophical thinking was sharpened by Heloise's brilliant mind. Her understanding of ethics and theology was deepened by their debates. Now, silence. Complete intellectual isolation. Two of the greatest minds of their generation, cut off from the one person who truly understood them. The daily routine at Saint Denis is designed to break you down, rebuild you as a servant of God. Morning prayers at dawn, hours of copying manuscripts, silent meals, more prayers, manual labour in the gardens, evening prayers, sleep on a hard wooden bed. Repeat. Abelard goes through the motions, but his mind is still racing. You can force a man to pray, but you can't force him to find peace. The brilliant philosopher is still trapped inside the traumatized monk. Meanwhile, Heloise adapts to convent life with the same intensity she once brought to studying Greek and Hebrew. She learns the prayers, follows the schedule, performs her duties without complaint. But here's what the other nuns don't see. Late at night, alone in her cell, she's still the woman who loved Peter Abelard. Her heart hasn't taken vows of celibacy. Her mind hasn't stopped questioning everything. She's becoming the perfect nun on the outside while burning up inside. The worst part, they're both so close to Paris, but they might as well be on different continents. Abelard at Saint-Denis, Heloise at Argenteuil, maybe 20 miles apart. Sometimes Abelard probably wonders if she's thinking about him. Sometimes Heloise definitely knows he's trying not to think about her. The silence between them grows heavier with each passing month. This isn't just physical separation, it's emotional surgery without anesthesia, cutting away the most important relationship either of them ever had. Years pass, 3, 4, 5 years of this enforced separation. Abelard throws himself into theological study, trying to lose himself in arguments about the nature of God, the Trinity, salvation. But even his religious scholarship becomes controversial. The man can't help but be brilliant, can't help but challenge orthodox thinking. Some of the other monks start to resent him. Here's this famous philosopher who thinks he's too good for simple monastery life. The isolation deepens, and here's something that'll blow your mind. Heloise becomes genuinely good at running a convent, like scary good. She organises the finances, mediates disputes between nuns, develops new educational programs. Her administrative skills are incredible. But every success feels hollow because the person she most wants to share it with, the person who would understand her intellectual achievements, isn't there. She's succeeding in a life she never wanted, excelling at a role that was forced on her. The thing about trauma is that eventually you have to make sense of it somehow. You can't just live with that much pain forever without trying to understand what happened and why. For Abelard, that processing begins around 1132, nearly a decade after the castration. He starts writing, not philosophy this time, not theology, something more dangerous and more honest. He's going to tell his own story, the real story, everything that happened. He calls it Historia Calamitatum, the story of my misfortunes. And right from the title, you know this isn't going to be some sanitized version of events. This is going to be raw, honest, probably too honest for his own good. Abelard sits in his monastery cell with parchment and ink, and he starts writing about his childhood, his early success as a teacher, his arrogance, his brilliance, building up to the moment when everything fell apart. Writing about Heloise is the hardest part. How do you capture a love that intense, that intellectually satisfying, that physically passionate, and then explain how it all went wrong? Abelard writes about their first meetings, their debates, the moment he realized she was more than just another brilliant student. He writes about the pregnancy, the secret marriage, the arguments, and then the night that changed everything. The words pour out of him like he's bleeding onto the page. But here's what's interesting about Historia Calamitatum. It's not just a memoir, it's philosophy disguised as autobiography. Abelard is trying to understand the relationship between human desire and divine will. Was their love a gift from God or a temptation from the devil? Was the violence that destroyed their relationship justice or cruelty? These aren't just personal questions, they're theological puzzles that could get him in trouble with church authorities all over again. As he writes, something unexpected happens. The act of putting their story into words, of organizing the chaos of memory into logical narrative, starts to give him a different kind of peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of understanding. Maybe their love wasn't a mistake. Maybe the suffering had meaning. Maybe telling this story could help other people who are struggling with the impossible tension between desire and duty, between human love and divine calling. When he finishes writing Historia Calamitatum, Abelard probably has no idea what he's just created. This isn't just the story of one man's misfortunes. It's about to become one of the most widely read documents in medieval Europe. And when Heloise reads it, when she sees their love story filtered through his perspective, his regrets, his attempts to make theological sense of their passion, she's going to have something to say about that. Something that will shock him to his core. 10 years. That's how long they'd been silent. Abelard at Saint Denis, wrestling with theology and his broken body. Heloise at Argenteau, leading prayers while her heart stayed frozen in that bedroom where everything changed. Neither writing, neither reaching out. The world kept spinning around their separate monasteries. But inside, time had stopped the night those men came for him. 10 years of pretending the past was buried. 10 years of lying to themselves that they'd moved on. But some stories refused to stay buried. Around 1132, a manuscript started circulating through the monasteries of France. Historia Calamitatum, the story of my misfortunes, written by Peter Abelard himself. It wasn't meant for her. He'd written it as a letter to a friend, sharing his philosophical struggles, his theological controversies, his falls from grace. But somewhere in those pages, he told their story, their secret love, the pregnancy, the castration, everything, and somehow that manuscript found its way to Heloise. Reunion through letters. Picture this: Heloise, now Abbess of Argenteuil, holding this manuscript in her hands, reading Abelard's version of their love story for the first time. And here's what gets me. He wrote about her like she was ancient history, a chapter in his spiritual journey, a mistake he'd overcome through God's grace. She was 30 years old, brilliant as ever, and he was discussing her like she was dead. That had to sting, but it also woke something up. She couldn't let it stand. This man who'd shaped her entire life, who'd given her philosophy and passion and a son, he was telling their story wrong, making it sound like their love was just youthful folly, like she'd been some naive girl who got swept away. Heloise knew exactly who she'd been back then. Brilliant, deliberate, in love, yes, but not blind. So she picked up her pen. After 10 years of silence, she wrote him a letter that would change everything. That first letter, it's like watching someone tear their chest open. She starts formal, calling him master, acknowledging his religious position, but then the real Heloise breaks through. To her master, or rather her father, husband, or rather brother, his handmaid, or rather his daughter, wife, or rather sister. Even her greeting refuses to fit into neat categories. She's saying, what exactly are we to each other now? Because whatever we are, it's not simple, it's not over. And then she gets brutally honest. You know, beloved, as the whole world knows, how much I have lost in you. Lost in you. Not lost because of you, or lost when I lost you. Lost in you. Like she'd poured herself into their relationship so completely that when it ended, part of her just disappeared. She's telling him that 10 years later, she still feels incomplete, still feels like half a person. That level of vulnerability, from an abbess to a monk, unthinkable. But here's where it gets really intense. She tells him that even now, during Mass, during the most sacred moments of her day, her mind wanders to their bedroom, to their touch, to their conversations that blurred the lines between philosophy and foreplay. Lewd visions of those pleasures take such a hold upon my unhappy soul that my thoughts are on their wantonness instead of on prayers. She's confessing that she's still, spiritually speaking, a mess, still burning for him. Abelard's response: careful, measured, religious. He acknowledges their past, but pivots immediately to God. Let us thank the Almighty for having freed us, through this great misfortune, from these dangerous delights. He's trying to reframe their castration as divine intervention, a blessing in disguise. You can practically hear Heloise rolling her eyes. This man who used to debate circles around bishops is giving her Sunday school answers. She deserved better, and she was about to tell him so. Her second letter hits like a philosophical earthquake. She challenges everything: his interpretation of their past, his understanding of sin, his attempt to spiritualize away their connection. God knows I never sought anything in you except yourself. I wanted simply you, nothing of yours. She's making a distinction that would influence Western thinking about love for centuries. Pure love versus transactional love. She loved him for him, not for status or security. That's not sin, that's sacred. And then she drops this bomb. If Augustus, emperor of the whole world, thought fit to honour me with marriage, and conferred all the earth on me to possess for ever. It would be dearer and more honourable to me to be called not his empress but your whore. Your whore. She's saying she'd rather be degraded in connection with Abelard than honoured by anyone else. That's not romantic comedy love, that's something deeper, something that scared even her. These weren't just love letters, they were philosophical treatises. Heloise was using their correspondence to work through questions that medieval thinkers struggled with. What makes an action sinful? Is it the act itself or the intention behind it? She argued that since she'd loved Abelard purely, their relationship couldn't be purely sinful. This was cutting-edge moral philosophy disguised as personal confession. She was changing theology through heartbreak. Revolutionary stuff, coming from a woman in the 12th century. But Abelard wasn't ready to go there with her. His letters became increasingly formal, almost cold. He urged her to redirect her passion toward God, to embrace her role as abbess fully, part protective instinct maybe, part genuine religious conviction, or maybe part fear. Fear that if he let himself remember how good it had been, he'd lose what little peace he'd found in monasticism. But Heloise wasn't interested in his peace. She wanted truth. The correspondence continued for years, and slowly something shifted. Not toward romance, they both knew that ship had sailed, but toward something else. Intellectual partnership, mutual respect. Abelard began consulting her on theological questions. Heloise became abbess of the Paraclete, the religious community Abelard had founded, and she transformed it, created rules specifically designed for women, championed education, built something lasting. Their love evolved into legacy. These letters would outlive them both by centuries, copied and recopied throughout medieval Europe, translated into dozens of languages, studied by philosophers, theologians, poets, lovers. Why? Because Heloise had done something almost impossible. She'd written about love without lies, about desire without shame, about loss without self-pity. She'd shown that intellectual women could love deeply and still think clearly, that passion and philosophy could coexist, that some stories transcend the people who live them. When you read their letters today, you're reading two people figuring out how to stay connected across an impossible divide. Not just physical distance, but spiritual, emotional, social. How do you love someone you can never touch again? How do you honour a relationship that society calls sinful? How do you move forward while still honouring what you've shared? These weren't just medieval questions. They're human questions. The kind that keep people awake at night, 800 years later. In the end, those letters became their real legacy. Not the scandal, not the castration, not the forced religious life, but the words they chose to send each other across years of silence and separation. Heloise's fierce honesty, Abelard's gradual awakening to her intellectual equality, their joint creation of a new way to think about love, loss, and the courage it takes to keep your heart open even when it's been broken beyond recognition. Some reunions happen in person, theirs happened on parchment. A profound discourse on sin and sacrifice. Here's where their story gets really fascinating. After years of silence, Heloise had read Abelard's autobiography, his version of their affair, and she was furious, not at the facts but at his interpretation. In her first letter back to him, she doesn't hold back. She calls him out for painting their love as some kind of moral failure, some weakness that led to his downfall. That's not how she remembers it, and she's about to prove why. Picture this. Heloise is now an abbess. She's running an entire religious community, respected by nobles and clergy across France. But when she sits down to write to Abelard, she becomes that brilliant young woman again, the one who could match him, thought for thought, argument for argument. And her first point: "You've got this all wrong, Peter. Our love wasn't a sin that destroyed us. It was the purest thing either of us ever experienced. She writes something that must have hit him like a thunderbolt. God knows I never sought anything in you except yourself. I wanted simply you, nothing of yours. Think about what she's saying here. No money, no status, no security, just him. Pure affection with no ulterior motive. In medieval terms, this was revolutionary thinking. Love for its own sake, not as a transaction or duty. And she's using this to build a theological argument. Heloise understood something about sin that even trained theologians missed. Intent matters more than action. She argues that since her love was pure, motivated by genuine affection rather than lust or greed, how could it be sinful? It's brilliant philosophical reasoning. She's taking Augustine's own teachings about the heart's intentions and turning them against the Church's blanket condemnation of their affair. And Abelard, master debater that he was, had no good counter-argument. But here's what gets me about Heloise's letters. She's not just defending their past, she's being brutally honest about her present. Even as an abbess during Mass itself, she admits her thoughts drift to their intimate moments together. Most people would never confess this, especially not to the man they once loved. But Heloise refuses to lie, even to herself. She'd rather be honest about her struggles than pretend to be someone she's not. Abelard's response reveals how differently men and women were expected to handle emotion in medieval times. He tells her basically, redirect that passion toward God. Move on, forget what we had and focus on salvation. But Heloise isn't having it. She writes back questioning why men get to decide what constitutes proper religious devotion for women. Why should her emotional honesty be seen as spiritual weakness rather than strength? She's fighting patriarchy with philosophy. The theological implications here are staggering. Heloise is essentially arguing that authentic human love, even passionate physical love, can coexist with divine love. This goes against centuries of Christian teaching that said earthly affection was a distraction from heavenly devotion. She's not just defending her relationship with Abelard, she's challenging the entire medieval worldview about how humans should relate to God and each other. Pretty bold for someone who's supposed to be quietly praying. What makes these letters so remarkable is how Heloise uses classical philosophy to support her arguments. She quotes Seneca, Augustine, Jerome, all the authorities Abelard himself taught her to respect. But she's wielding their words like weapons against his position. When he says their love was sinful because it led to his castration, she counters, the punishment doesn't define the crime. Wrong doesn't become right just because it ends badly. The logic is unassailable. There's this moment in her letters where Heloise essentially calls Abelard a coward. Not directly, but the implication is clear. She's saying, you're rewriting our history to make yourself feel better about your trauma. You're calling our love sinful because it's easier than admitting you lost something precious. And maybe, just maybe, she's right. Maybe his shift toward viewing their relationship as God's punishment was psychological self-protection rather than spiritual growth. The debate gets really intense when they start discussing sacrifice versus choice. Abelard argues that becoming a monk was his sacrifice for their sins, but Heloise points out that she became a nun not because God called her, but because he ordered her to. Her sacrifice wasn't to God, it was to him. She gave up her freedom, her potential for future love, her chance at motherhood, all for a man who now wants to pretend their connection was spiritually meaningless. Here's where Heloise's argument becomes almost modern in its psychological insight. She suggests that Abelard's guilt isn't really about God, it's about power. As her teacher, he held authority over her. As an older man, he had advantages she didn't. Maybe his shame comes from recognizing that imbalance, not from believing their love was inherently wrong. It's a sophisticated analysis of consent and ethics that most people weren't ready to hear in the 12th century. The correspondence reveals something beautiful and tragic. Even separated by monastic walls and a decade of silence, their intellectual connection remained unbroken. They could still challenge each other's ideas, still push each other toward deeper truths. Their letters read like the continuation of conversations that began in Fulbert's house years earlier. The tragedy isn't that their love affair ended, it's that their intellectual partnership was forced underground, hidden behind religious obligations and social expectations. What's fascinating is how their debate influenced Abelard's later philosophical work. His treatise Ethics, which became hugely important in medieval thought, reflects many of Heloise's arguments about intention and moral responsibility. She literally shaped his thinking about how we judge right and wrong, yet history tends to credit him alone for these insights. It's a perfect example of how women's intellectual contributions were often absorbed into men's work, without recognition or credit. The letters also reveal Heloise's growing confidence as a religious leader. She stops just defending their past love and starts questioning broader church practices. Why do convents follow rules written for male monks? Why can't religious women have different spiritual needs and expressions? She's using her position as abbess to advocate for practical reforms, turning her personal struggle into institutional change. The woman who once challenged her teacher now challenges the entire religious establishment. Near the end of their correspondence, there's this shift in tone. Abelard begins acknowledging the validity of some of her points, though he never fully admits she was right. Heloise, meanwhile, seems to find peace not through accepting his interpretation of their love as sinful, but through proving that her interpretation was equally valid. She doesn't need his approval anymore. She's found her own theological ground to stand on, her own relationship with truth and God. Their final letters read like two philosophers who have fought their way to mutual respect. They disagree fundamentally about the nature of their past, but they recognize each other's intellectual integrity. Heloise never recants her position that their love was pure. Abelard never fully accepts it. But somehow, through all this theological wrestling, they've created something unprecedented, a written record of how two brilliant minds can love each other precisely because they refuse to surrender their individual truths. A woman's voice in the Middle Ages. Here's what's wild about Heloise. She didn't just write letters, she wrote manifestos. In the 12th century, when women were expected to whisper prayers and embroider quietly, Heloise was demanding theological debates in writing. Her correspondence with Abelard isn't just love letters, it's intellectual warfare. She's challenging the most famous philosopher in Europe, questioning his reasoning, dismantling his arguments about sin and salvation, and she's doing it all from inside a convent. Think about the audacity of that for a moment. When Heloise became abbess of the Paraclete, she faced a problem. All the rules governing religious communities were written by men for men, fasting schedules that ignored women's biology, work requirements that assumed male strength, clothing regulations designed for masculine bodies. So Heloise did something unprecedented. She wrote to Abelard demanding new rules, not requesting, demanding. She laid out specific arguments for why women's religious communities needed different structures. Her reasoning was brilliant, systematic, and completely revolutionary for the time. Listen to how she argues about menstruation. This is medieval France, remember? Women's bodies were considered sinful, unclean, shameful. Heloise writes to Abelard, "Nature's course makes women weak at certain times, but instead of accepting shame, she demands practical accommodations, lighter fasting during menstruation, modified work schedules. She's treating women's biology as a fact to be managed intelligently, not a curse to be endured silently." For the 12th century, this was mind-blowing progressive thinking. She's basically inventing workplace equity 800 years early. Here's where Heloise gets dangerous. She starts questioning the entire concept of religious authority. When Abelard tells her to redirect her passion toward God, she pushes back, hard. She writes, "I never sought anything in you except yourself. I wanted simply you, nothing of yours." She's arguing that pure human love, that authentic emotion might actually be closer to divine truth than forced religious devotion. This isn't just personal. She's challenging the Church's monopoly on defining what's sacred and what's sinful. Imagine how threatening that was. The clothing thing is fascinating. Medieval convents forced nuns to wear the same robes as monks, heavy wool designed for men's bodies, completely impractical for women's daily life. Heloise writes detailed arguments for lighter fabrics, better fitting garments, clothing that actually works for women doing physical labour. She's not being vain, she's being logical. Why should women suffer unnecessarily because some male monk in the 6th century decided what holy clothing looks like? Her practical feminism is centuries ahead of her time. She's redesigning religious life from the ground up. But the most revolutionary thing Heloise does? She refuses to lie about her feelings. Even as an abbess, she admits she still burns with desire for Abelard. During Mass, she confesses, "Lewd visions of those pleasures take such a hold upon my unhappy soul." In an era when women were supposed to be either pure virgins or repentant sinners, Heloise claims a third option, honest humanity. She's essentially saying, I'm a whole person with complex emotions, and I refuse to pretend otherwise. That honesty was dangerous, it still is. Her theological arguments are brilliant. When the Church teaches that all sexual desire is sinful, Heloise argues about intention. If love is pure, if it seeks the good of the other person, how can it be evil? She's essentially developing a philosophy of ethical relationships. The idea that the motivation behind an action matters more than the action itself. This thinking will later influence Abelard's masterwork Ethics. But the core insights, they're coming from Heloise. She's reshaping medieval philosophy from inside a convent, one letter at a time. The power dynamics here are insane. Heloise is a woman, a nun, supposedly submissive to male authority. But in her letters, she's teaching Abelard, correcting him, challenging his reasoning about ethics and theology. She writes with the confidence of someone who knows she's the intellectual equal of Europe's most famous philosopher. And here's the thing, Abelard takes her seriously. He engages with her arguments, incorporates her insights into his later work. She's created a space where her mind matters more than her gender. That's revolutionary. Heloise understood something about women's education that wouldn't be widely accepted for centuries. She argued that women needed different teaching methods, not because they were inferior, but because they learned differently. She advocated for more discussion, less rote memorization, more practical application of religious principles. She wanted women to understand why they were following rules, not just blindly obey them. She was essentially inventing feminist pedagogy in the 12th century. Her educational reforms at the Paraclete became a model that other convents quietly began to copy. Here's what makes Heloise truly dangerous to the medieval establishment. She refuses to accept anyone else's interpretation of her own experience. When Abelard tries to reframe their love as sinful temptation that led them both astray, she pushes back. No, she essentially says, that's not my truth. She insists on her right to define the meaning of her own life, her own choices, her own feelings. In a world where women's experiences were constantly interpreted by male authorities, priests, fathers, husbands, Heloise claims absolute sovereignty over her own narrative. That's feminist theory centuries early. The ripple effects of Heloise's voice spread through medieval Europe in ways most people don't realize. Other abbesses began writing letters, making arguments, demanding reforms. Her correspondence with Abelard became a template, proof that women could engage in high-level theological and philosophical discourse. Convents started keeping better records of their own intellectual work. Women began asserting more autonomy in religious communities. She didn't just speak for herself, she opened a door that other women walked through. Her voice gave permission for other women to find theirs. What's brilliant about Heloise is how she uses the system against itself. She's operating within the framework of medieval Christianity, but she's stretching it, testing its boundaries, finding loopholes. She argues that God created women with different needs, so serving God properly means accommodating those differences. She can't directly challenge male authority, so she positions herself as a better interpreter of divine will. She's basically hacking the patriarchy from the inside, using religious language to advocate for women's rights. It's intellectually sophisticated and politically brilliant. The economic arguments Heloise makes are fascinating too. She points out that convents run more efficiently when they're organised around women's actual capabilities and needs. Better food preparation, more effective division of labour, smarter resource management. She's not just arguing for women's dignity, she's making a practical business case. Communities that accommodate women's differences are more productive, more sustainable, more spiritually healthy. She's connecting feminism with pragmatism in ways that made her reforms harder to dismiss. Smart politics wrapped in theological language. By the time Heloise died in 1164, the Paraclete had become a model community. Other abbesses were visiting, studying her reforms, taking ideas back to their own convents. Her letters were being copied and circulated. Women throughout Europe were reading her words and thinking, yes, she's right. We deserve better. The intellectual confidence she modelled, the refusal to be silenced, the insistence that women's voices mattered in theological debates, these ideas spread like wildfire through the networks of medieval religious women. She'd started a quiet revolution. Later medieval women writers, Christine de Pizan, Marguerite Porete, Mechtilde of Magdeburg, they all knew Heloise's letters. You can trace lines of influence through centuries of women's writing. Her combination of intellectual rigour, emotional honesty, and political strategy became a template. The idea that women could be both spiritual and sensual, both devout and autonomous, both obedient and rebellious, that complex, contradictory femininity that Heloise embodied, it echoes through women's literature for centuries. She gave medieval women permission to be fully human. Here's Heloise's ultimate legacy. She proved that a woman's voice, speaking her truth with courage and intelligence, could reshape the world around her, not through violence or dramatic rebellion, but through the quiet power of refusing to be silenced. Her letters survive today because they capture something timeless, the human struggle to be known, to be understood, to be taken seriously for who we really are. That need to speak our truth, even when it's dangerous, that's Heloise's gift to us. The reminder that our voices matter, that our experiences are valid, that our stories deserve to be heard. Abelard's unexpected influence. Here's something most people don't know about the Abelard and Heloise story. Those brutal, honest letters Heloise wrote, they didn't just preserve their love for history, they actually changed how Abelard thought about ethics, sin, and human nature. After reading her challenges to his theology, after wrestling with her questions about intention versus action, Abelard wrote his masterpiece, Ethica, also called Know Thyself. And this book, it revolutionized medieval philosophy, all because a brilliant woman refused to stay quiet. Think about this for a second. Abelard had been teaching philosophy for decades before he met Heloise. He was already famous across Europe, but his most influential work came after their correspondence began. Coincidence? Not likely. See, Heloise's letters contained some seriously sophisticated philosophical arguments. She wasn't just pouring her heart out, she was challenging fundamental assumptions about morality, about what makes an action right or wrong. And Abelard, he was listening, he was learning from her, even if he couldn't admit it publicly. Ethica appeared around 1139, several years into their letter exchange. The timing matters. This wasn't just Abelard working alone in his monastery. This was him responding to the most intellectually challenging person he'd ever encountered. The book's central argument, that sin exists in intention, not in the act itself. Sound familiar? That's exactly what Heloise had been arguing in her letters. She'd written about loving him purely, arguing that pure intention couldn't be sinful. Abelard took that insight and built an entire ethical system around it. Before Ethica, medieval thinkers mostly focused on actions. Did you steal? Sin. Did you lie? Sin. Pretty straightforward, right? But Abelard flipped this completely. He argued that what matters is your mental state when you act. Two people could perform the exact same action, one from malice, one from love, and only one would be sinning. This was revolutionary thinking. It shifted the entire focus of moral philosophy from external behavior to internal motivation. And you can trace this insight directly back to Heloise's letters about love and intention. Here's where it gets really interesting. Heloise had written something that must have haunted Abelard. God knows I never sought anything in you except yourself. I wanted simply you, nothing of yours. She was making a distinction between pure love and selfish desire, between wanting someone for who they are versus what they can give you. In Ethica, Abelard develops this exact concept. He argues that moral worth depends on the purity of your intention, not on what you gain from your actions. That's Heloise's voice echoing through medieval philosophy. The book caused immediate controversy. Church authorities weren't thrilled with Abelard suggesting that intention mattered more than following rules. If people start thinking about why they do things instead of just obeying, well, that leads to questions. Dangerous questions, but scholars ate it up. Ethica became required reading in universities across Europe. Students were debating Abelard's ideas from Paris to Oxford to Bologna, and every time they discussed the relationship between intention and morality, they were essentially discussing insights that came from a woman's letters, from Heloise's refusal to accept simple answers. What makes this even more remarkable? Women weren't supposed to influence theology in the 12th century. They couldn't teach in universities. They couldn't preach. Most couldn't even read. But Heloise's ideas were spreading across medieval Europe through Abelard's work. Her philosophical insights were being debated by the most brilliant minds of her time. She was effectively teaching the teachers, shaping the conversation about ethics and human nature, all through letters she wrote from her convent, where she was supposedly cut off from the intellectual world. The irony is incredible. Let's talk about specific examples. In Ethica, Abelard discusses the concept of consent in sin. He argues that you can't accidentally sin, that sinning requires deliberate choice to do wrong. This directly echoes arguments Heloise made about their relationship. She'd insisted that because she loved him truly and completely, her actions couldn't be sinful regardless of church law. Abelard took that logic and applied it universally. If you don't intend to do wrong, if you're acting from pure motives, then you haven't actually sinned. Revolutionary stuff for its time. The influence goes deeper than just ethics. Abelard's later writings show a much more nuanced understanding of human psychology. Before Heloise, his work was more abstract, more focused on logical proofs. After their correspondence, he's writing about the complexity of human motivation, about how people can hold contradictory feelings, about how circumstances affect moral choice. That psychological sophistication, that's coming from years of reading Heloise's brutally honest self-analysis. She taught him that humans are complicated, contradictory creatures, not just logical machines following moral algorithms. Ethica also tackles the question of whether knowledge leads to virtue. Can you accidentally be good? Abelard argues that true virtue requires understanding that you have to know what's right and choose it deliberately. This connects to something Heloise had written about their relationship. She'd claimed that their love, because it was based on mutual intellectual respect and genuine knowledge of each other, was inherently more valuable than marriages based on social convention. Abelard took that insight about love and applied it to virtue in general. Knowledge plus intention equals moral worth. The book's influence on medieval thought can't be overstated. Thomas Aquinas read it. Duns Scotus engaged with its arguments. Even critics had to respond to Abelard's ideas about intention and moral responsibility. But here's what they probably didn't realise. Many of those ideas originated in letters from a woman they would never have been allowed to debate directly. Heloise was influencing the course of medieval philosophy from behind convent walls, through the mind of a man who'd learned to see ethics differently because of her challenges to his thinking. It's an incredible example of intellectual influence operating through unconventional channels. Modern philosophers still study Ethica today. The questions Abelard raised about intention, about the relationship between knowledge and virtue, about what makes an action morally significant, these remain central to ethical theory. When contemporary philosophers debate the role of intention in moral responsibility, they're participating in a conversation that began with Heloise's letters. When they discuss whether good intentions can justify problematic actions, they're wrestling with issues she first raised. Her voice echoes through centuries of philosophical thought, even though most people don't know her name. There's something beautiful about this influence being hidden for so long. Abelard never explicitly credited Heloise with shaping his ethical thinking. That wasn't how things worked in medieval academia. But if you read their letters alongside Ethica, the connections are undeniable. Her questions become his arguments. Her insights about love and intention become his theories about sin and virtue. She posed the problems, he systematized the solutions. It was intellectual collaboration disguised as personal correspondence. Two brilliant minds working together to understand human nature and moral choice, even while separated by monastery walls. This raises fascinating questions about how ideas develop and spread. How many other influential philosophical works were shaped by voices that don't appear in the official record? How many insights attributed to famous male thinkers actually originated in conversations with women, students, or other marginalized voices? Abelard's case suggests that intellectual influence often flows through networks we can't see, that the history of ideas is messier and more collaborative than traditional accounts suggest. Heloise proves that brilliance finds a way to influence the world, even when it's officially silenced. The tragedy is that we nearly lost Heloise's voice entirely. Her letters survived by chance, copied by monks who found the romance compelling. But how many other brilliant medieval women left no trace? How many insights were lost because they couldn't publish, couldn't teach, couldn't participate in official scholarly debates? Heloise managed to influence centuries of philosophical thought through letters to her former lover. Imagine what she could have accomplished if she'd had direct access to the intellectual world of her time. The loss is incalculable. So when you see Ethica referenced in philosophy textbooks, when you encounter Abelard's theories about intention and moral responsibility, remember Heloise. Remember that some of the most influential ideas about human nature and ethics came from a woman writing letters in a 12th century convent, a woman who refused to accept simple answers about love, sin, and moral choice. Her questions changed how we think about what makes us human. Not bad for someone history tried to reduce to just a tragic lover. Heloise was a philosopher in her own right, and philosophy is richer because she refused to stay quiet. Love, desire, and the power of intention. Here's what gets me about Heloise and Abelard. They were having conversations about love that sound like they could happen on any dating app today. Seriously, she's writing letters in the 1130s, asking the same questions we ask now. Is wanting someone purely physical love or something deeper? Can you love someone completely while knowing they're wrong for you? Does intention matter more than outcome? They were philosophers, so obviously they couldn't just break up normally. They had to turn heartbreak into theory. Think about this. Heloise writes to Abelard, "God knows I never sought anything in you except yourself. I wanted simply you, nothing of yours. No medieval woman was supposed to talk like this." But here she is, basically inventing the concept of unconditional love. Not love for status, wealth, or security, just him. That line could be an Instagram caption today. I want you, not your stuff. Except she's risking her reputation, her position as an abbess, everything, just to tell him this truth. Abelard tries to redirect their correspondence toward God, towards safer spiritual territory. Classic move, right? When someone gets too emotionally intense, you try to change the subject. But Heloise won't let him off the hook. She keeps bringing it back to their connection, their physical desire, their intellectual bond. She's basically saying, don't gaslight me into thinking this wasn't real. She refuses to sanitize their love story to make everyone else comfortable. That takes serious courage, then and now. Here's where their philosophy gets really modern. Heloise argues that the intention behind an action matters more than the action itself. If she loved Abelard with pure intention, how could it be sinful? This is cognitive behavioral therapy territory. It's not what happened to you, it's how you think about what happened. Medieval philosophers called it ethics of intention. We call it emotional intelligence. Same concept, different millennium. She's essentially arguing that love can be sacred even when society says it's wrong. But here's what's wild. Abelard develops his entire ethical system, partly because of these letters. His work Ethica argues that sin exists in intention, not just in action. Heloise pushed him to think deeper about moral philosophy. How many relationships today actually make both people better thinkers? She wasn't just his lover or his student. She was his intellectual equal, challenging his assumptions, forcing him to evolve his ideas. That's partnership goals right there. Mutual growth through honest disagreement. The power dynamic between them is complicated. And honestly, it sounds like modern dating. He's older, more established, her teacher. She's younger, but intellectually gifted, financially dependent, but emotionally independent. Sound familiar? They're navigating consent, agency, and equality in ways that still make us uncomfortable today. Medieval relationships weren't supposed to have this much psychological complexity. Yet here's Heloise, clearly stating her choices, owning her desires, refusing to be treated like a victim of circumstances she helped create. Heloise writes something that could be straight out of a modern therapy session. She admits that during Mass, instead of praying, she's thinking about their physical relationship. She's not ashamed of this. She's stating it as evidence that you can't just decide to stop loving someone. 1200 years before psychology recognized trauma bonding or attachment theory, she's describing how desire works in the human brain. You can't think your way out of wanting someone. The heart has its own logic. Their letters reveal something crucial about long-distance relationships. They had to communicate purely through words. No body language, no tone of voice, no physical presence, just ideas, pure intellectual and emotional connection. Today we'd call it sapiosexual, being attracted to intelligence. Heloise fell in love with Abelard's mind first. Their physical relationship ended brutally, but the mental connection, that lasted decades. It's the medieval version of falling for someone's personality on a dating app before meeting them. Here's what makes their correspondence timeless. They're both trying to figure out how to love someone when you can't be with them. Do you let go? Do you hold on? Is it healthier to forget or to remember? Abelard wants to move forward spiritually. Heloise wants to honour what they had. These are the exact conversations people have after breakups today. How do you process a relationship that was real and meaningful, but couldn't continue? They're working through it in real time, with philosophy as their therapy. Heloise makes an argument that sounds incredibly modern. She says she became a nun not because God called her, but because Abelard asked her to. She's admitting that her religious life is performance, not authentic calling. Today we'd call this codependency, or maybe just deep love that prioritizes the other person's needs over your own truth. She's not seeking martyrdom points. She's just being honest about why she made the choice she made. How refreshing is that level of self-awareness? Their ethical debates sound like modern discussions about relationships and moral responsibility. Is it wrong to love someone if that love causes pain? Is sexual desire inherently sinful, or is the shame around it the real problem? Heloise essentially argues for sex positivity. That desire itself isn't evil. Meanwhile, Abelard struggles with guilt and tries to reframe their relationship as a spiritual lesson. It's the same conversation couples have today about pleasure, shame, and whether wanting someone physically diminishes love or enhances it. What revolutionary about Heloise is her emotional honesty. She refuses to lie about still wanting him physically. In the 12th century, women weren't supposed to have sexual desire, let alone admit to it. But she writes, "The pleasures of lovers which we shared have been too sweet, they can never displease me." She's rejecting the narrative that women should be ashamed of sexual fulfillment. That's not medieval thinking, that's modern sex therapy. Own your pleasure, don't apologize for what brought you joy. Their correspondence creates the template for how we think about romantic love in Western culture. Before Heloise, love literature was mostly about courtly romance. Distant, idealized, often unconsummated. But she writes about real intimacy, intellectual, emotional, and physical. She describes love as partnership, not worship. Her letters influenced everything from Renaissance poetry to modern romance novels. She basically invented the idea that healthy love involves two equals, choosing each other, not one person adoring another from a distance. Here's what connects their story to every modern relationship. They had to figure out how to love each other while being completely honest about who they were. No pretending, no performance, no trying to be someone else to keep the relationship going. Heloise loved a brilliant, arrogant, complicated man. Abelard loved a woman who was smarter than most of his male colleagues and refused to hide it. They saw each other clearly and loved anyway. That's harder than it sounds, then or now. The question that haunts their letters is one we still ask. Can love be both sacred and sexual? Is physical desire compatible with spiritual connection? Medieval Christianity said no. Modern psychology says yes, absolutely. Heloise was arguing for integrated love, body, mind, and spirit together. Not compartmentalized, not apologetic. She wanted all of Abelard, and she wanted him to want all of her. That's what healthy relationships look like today. She was just 800 years ahead of her time in recognizing it. Their letters prove that the fundamental questions about love haven't changed. How do you love someone completely while maintaining your own identity? How do you balance desire with responsibility? When is sacrifice love, and when is it just fear? Heloise and Abelard were philosophers, so they turned these questions into formal arguments. But strip away the Latin and medieval context. These are the same conversations happening in couples therapy offices today. Love is still love. The heart wants what it wants, then and now. The enduring legacy. Here's what happened after the letters stopped. Their words didn't just disappear into monastery archives. They exploded across medieval Europe like intellectual wildfire. Every court poet, every love-struck nobleman, every writer trying to capture what it meant to love someone completely, they all had copies of Abelard and Heloise's correspondence. By 1200, less than 50 years after Heloise died, their letters were being copied and shared across France, England, Germany. Think about that. No printing press, no internet, just scribes working by candlelight, making sure these words survived. The first writer to really understand what they'd created was Chrétien de Troyes. He's the guy who basically invented Arthurian romance, Lancelot and Guinevere. That whole impossible love between a knight and his lord's wife. That comes straight from Heloise's letters. She wrote about loving someone you can never truly possess, about desire that survives separation, about choosing love over social convention. Chrétien took those ideas and turned them into Camelot. Every time Lancelot says he'd rather die than dishonour his love for Guinevere, that's Heloise speaking through him. But it wasn't just French writers. The letters crossed the English Channel and found Geoffrey Chaucer. You know the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer understood something most people missed about Heloise. She wasn't just a lover, she was a philosopher. The wife of Bath, that character who argues that women want sovereignty over their husbands. She's channeling Heloise's intellectual fire. Heloise had written that women deserve to make their own choices about love and marriage. Chaucer put those revolutionary ideas into the mouth of a fictional woman 2 centuries later. Then came Petrarch, the Italian poet who basically created the sonnet form. His entire concept of idealized love, that beautiful agony of loving someone from a distance, that's Abelard and Heloise distilled into 14 lines. Petrarch wrote about Laura the same way Abelard wrote about Heloise in those love songs that made him famous in Paris. The difference? Petrarch knew he was writing literature. Abelard thought he was just in love. Sometimes the most influential art happens when people aren't trying to make art at all. By the Renaissance, their story had become a template. Every tragic love story borrowed from them. Romeo and Juliet, star-crossed lovers kept apart by family conflict. That's just Abelard and Heloise with a different ending. The difference is Shakespeare's couple dies young and beautiful. Abelard and Heloise lived. They grew old. They kept writing to each other across decades of separation. Their love didn't flame out in passion. It deepened into something more complex, more real. That's what made it so dangerous to the medieval world. Here's what really shook medieval society. Heloise proved that a woman could be intellectually equal to any man of her time. Her letters aren't just emotional, they're philosophical masterpieces. She quotes classical authors, makes theological arguments, challenges the greatest philosopher of her age on his own terms, and she wins half those arguments. For a world that believed women were intellectually inferior, emotionally unstable, closer to animals than angels, Heloise's letters were like reading evidence that everything they believed about gender was wrong. The Catholic Church tried to bury their story for obvious reasons. A celibate philosopher seduces his student, has a child out of wedlock, challenges church authority, not exactly the image they wanted to promote. But their letters kept circulating in underground networks. Monks copied them secretly. Noble women passed them between courts. By the late Middle Ages, you could find copies hidden in private libraries from London to Constantinople. The Church's attempt at censorship just made the letters more famous, more dangerous. Fast forward to the Enlightenment. Voltaire called Heloise the most eloquent woman who ever lived. Rousseau wept reading her letters and wrote his own novel inspired by them. The Romantics went absolutely wild for their story. Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft, they all saw in Heloise a woman who refused to be silenced, who spoke her truth regardless of consequences. For the Romantics, she wasn't just a medieval curiosity. She was a revolutionary who happened to live 8 centuries too early. Napoleon Bonaparte, of all people, was obsessed with their story. In 1817, he had their remains moved to Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, where they were buried together in an elaborate Gothic tomb. His reasoning? Their love affair represented the triumph of passion over convention, individual will over social control. For a guy who'd just conquered half of Europe, that message probably resonated. Today, their tomb is one of the most visited spots in Paris. People leave love letters, flowers, lipstick kisses on the stone. But here's where their legacy gets complicated for modern readers. We live in an era that's hyper-aware of power imbalances, consent, exploitation. Abelard was Heloise's teacher, nearly twice her age, in a position of authority over her. By today's standards, that relationship would be problematic at best, illegal at worst. Yet Heloise's own words complicate that simple narrative. She describes herself as an intellectual equal, someone who made deliberate choices. She argues with him, challenges him, refuses to accept his attempts to reframe their story. Modern feminists are split on how to read Heloise. Some see her as an early voice of female agency. a woman who refused to be silenced or diminished. Others argue she was groomed by an older man and then convinced herself it was love. Both interpretations can be partially true. That's what makes her letters so powerful. They don't offer easy answers. They force us to grapple with messy questions about desire, power, agency, and the difference between exploitation and genuine connection. In universities today, their correspondence is taught in philosophy departments, literature courses, women's studies programs, and medieval history classes. Students analyze Heloise's theological arguments, her defense of intention over action, her challenge to medieval concepts of sin and virtue. Her letters are studied alongside works by Thomas Aquinas and Augustine, not as curiosities, but as serious contributions to Western philosophical thought. That's something medieval scholars never could have imagined. A woman's voice standing equal to the Church Fathers. Their story keeps getting retold because every generation finds something different in it. The Victorians focused on the tragic romance. The 1960s counterculture saw them as rebels against religious authority. Feminists of the 1970s celebrated Heloise's intellectual independence. Today's readers grapple with questions of consent and power. The letters survive because they contain enough complexity to support multiple interpretations. They're not simple, they don't offer easy moral lessons. They're as messy and contradictory as real human beings. Modern adaptations keep appearing. Novels, plays, operas, films, even a rock musical. Most of them miss the point. They focus on the drama, the seduction, the castration, the forbidden love. But the real story is in the letters themselves. Two brilliant minds trying to make sense of what happened to them, trying to understand whether their love was sacred or sinful, trying to figure out how to live with the consequences of their choices. That's universal. That's why their words still cut so deep. Psychology textbooks reference their letters when discussing attachment, trauma, and the persistence of emotional bonds. Heloise described what we now call intrusive thoughts, the way memories of past intimacy can overwhelm present circumstances. She wrote about cognitive dissonance, the mental struggle between religious duty and emotional truth. She analysed the difference between physical desire and emotional connection centuries before those concepts had names. Her self-awareness was extraordinary for any era, revolutionary for the 12th century. As you fall asleep tonight, think about this. Heloise's letters have survived nearly 900 years. They've influenced countless writers, changed how Western culture thinks about love, desire, and women's intellectual capacity. They've sparked debates about consent, power, and agency that continue today, all because one brilliant woman refused to stay silent about her experience. She insisted on telling her own story, in her own words, regardless of who might be scandalized. That courage, that refusal to be erased, that's her true legacy. That's what made her immortal. Their lives forever intertwined. By 1142, Abelard was 63 and broken. 20 years had passed since that brutal night of castration. 20 years of theological controversy, exile, condemnation. The man who once commanded lecture halls across Paris now lived quietly at the monastery of Saint Marcel, still writing, still debating, but his body was failing. The fire that once made him the most magnetic teacher in Europe had dimmed to embers, yet even in his final months he was working on his last theological treatise, still questioning, still pushing boundaries. April 21st, 1142. Peter Abelard drew his last breath. The great philosopher, the man whose love affair had scandalized medieval Europe, died surrounded by monks who barely understood what they were witnessing. Here was a mind that had revolutionized how people thought about logic, ethics, and God himself. A man whose personal letters had become literature, and now silence. Word reached Heloise at the Paraclete. The woman who had loved him through everything was now truly alone. Picture Heloise receiving that news. 53 years old, abbess of the Paraclete for over a decade. She had built that community into something remarkable: libraries, schools, a place where women could actually think and write and debate. But underneath all that achievement, underneath 20 years of religious service, she was still the woman who had written those devastating letters, still the woman who had never stopped loving Peter Abelard. And now he was gone. 22 more years. That's how long Heloise lived without him. 22 years of running the Paraclete, of corresponding with bishops and theologians, of being one of the most powerful women in the medieval church. But here's what gets me. In all those years, in all her official letters and documents, she never remarried that intellectual fire she'd shown in her letters to Abelard. It was like that part of her had died with him in 1142. May 16th, 1164. Heloise d'Argenteau died at the age of 65. The brilliant woman who had argued against marriage, who had challenged the greatest philosopher of her age, who had built a religious community from nothing, gone. But here's where the story gets interesting, because death, for Abelard and Heloise, wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of their transformation from real people into something else entirely, from lovers into legend, from flesh and blood into eternal symbol. They buried Heloise next to Abelard at the Paraclete, side by side, finally together after decades of separation. But almost immediately, stories started spreading. Witnesses claimed that when they lowered Heloise's body into the grave, Abelard's skeleton moved. His arms reached out to embrace her. Now, obviously that's physically impossible. Bodies don't move after 22 years. But the fact that people believed it, the fact that this legend spread across medieval Europe, that tells you everything. Think about what that image meant to medieval minds. Here were two people who had been torn apart by violence, by social pressure, by the rigid rules of their time. But death couldn't separate them. Even in the grave, love conquered everything. The embracing arms became the perfect metaphor for what their story represented: passion that transcends physical existence, love that survives scandal, castration, decades of separation, and even death itself. That's powerful mythology. Their tomb at the Paraclete became a pilgrimage site. Not for religious reasons, for romantic ones. Couples would travel hundreds of miles to see where the great lovers were buried. They'd leave flowers, say prayers, promise eternal devotion. Medieval people didn't have many examples of romantic love in their literature. Most marriages were business arrangements. Most stories ended in tragedy. But Abelard and Heloise, their love seemed to conquer everything, even the grave. During the French Revolution, everything changed. Monasteries were destroyed. Religious communities scattered. The Paraclete was demolished in 1792. But even revolutionaries recognized the power of this love story. In 1817, their remains were moved to Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. Same tomb design, Gothic arches, medieval styling, and yes, the sculpture still shows Abelard's arms reaching toward Heloise, because some stories are too powerful for even revolution to destroy. Today, Père Lachaise is the most visited cemetery in the world. People go there to see Jim Morrison's grave, Oscar Wilde's tomb, but they also go to see Abelard and Heloise. 900 years later, couples still leave love notes at their tomb, still promise eternal devotion, still believe that somehow, in that Gothic monument, love conquered death. I mean, think about that. A medieval philosophy professor and his student still inspiring lovers today. But what exactly did they give the world? It wasn't just a romantic story. Their letters literally changed how Western culture thinks about love. Before Abelard and Heloise, most literature presented love as either purely spiritual or purely physical, sacred or profane. Their correspondence showed something different. Love as intellectual partnership. Love as two minds challenging each other. Love as conversation that transcends physical desire while still honoring it. That was revolutionary. Every romance novel you've ever read, every love song about eternal devotion, every movie about lovers separated by circumstances, it all traces back to them. Tristan and Isolde, Romeo and Juliet, even modern stories like The Notebook, they're all variations on themes that Abelard and Heloise established. The older man and younger woman, the forbidden love, the separation by social forces, the letters that keep love alive, the belief that true love survives everything. And here's the thing that still haunts scholars. Was their love actually eternal, or did we just want it to be? Abelard's later letters suggest he had genuinely redirected his passion toward God. Heloise admitted she still burned with desire, even as an abbess, so maybe eternal love isn't about both people feeling the same thing forever. Maybe it's about creating something, art, ideas, inspiration, that outlasts both people, something that makes strangers care about your story 9 centuries later. What they really gave us was permission to believe that passionate love and intellectual connection aren't opposites, that you can desire someone and also respect their mind, that the deepest intimacy happens when two people challenge each other's thinking while sharing their bodies. Before Heloise, women in literature were either pure virgins or dangerous temptresses. She was both brilliant and sexual, both spiritual and physical. She made complexity possible. Their tomb at Père Lachaise still draws visitors every day. Modern couples still promise each other eternal love while standing over those medieval remains. Because we need to believe that love can transcend everything, social pressure, physical separation, even death itself. We need stories that prove the human heart is stronger than any force trying to crush it. And no story does that quite like theirs. No love quite like theirs survives so completely. So as you drift off tonight, remember this. Abelard and Heloise didn't just love each other. They created love as we understand it. They showed us that true intimacy is intellectual and physical and spiritual all at once. That letters can be more powerful than presents. That sometimes the most beautiful love stories are also the most painful ones. And that 900 years later, 2 medieval scholars can still teach us what it means to love fearlessly. Sleep well. A final thought, the power of love and truth. So here we are, end of the story. Abelard and Heloise are both dead, buried side by side in Paris, but their letters, still being read, still making people fall in love, still making scholars argue about power and consent and what it means to choose your own path. And I keep coming back to this one thing. Heloise never apologized. Not once. Not for loving him. Not for the pregnancy. Not for speaking her mind when every rule said women should stay quiet. Think about that for a second. The year is 1132. She's an abbess now, supposed to be this holy, pure figure. The church expects her to say she's sorry, that their love was sinful, that she's found God and forgotten all about physical desire. Instead, she writes to Abelard and basically says, I still want you. I still think our love was beautiful, and I'm not going to lie about it. That takes guts we can barely imagine today. Heloise lived in a world that told women their thoughts didn't matter, that their desires were dangerous, that the smartest thing they could do was stay quiet and let men make the decisions. She looked at all of that and said no. She used her mind, she argued with philosophers, she challenged the man she loved when she thought he was wrong. She ran a religious community her way, not the way the rulebook said she should. And here's what gets me. She proved that love and intelligence aren't opposites. The medieval world tried to separate them. You could be smart and holy, or you could be passionate and worldly. Pick one. Heloise said that's nonsense. She loved Abelard with her body and her mind. Her letters are both deeply emotional and philosophically brilliant. She felt everything and thought about everything. She refused to choose between her heart and her brain. Her letters became famous because they're so honest, it almost hurts to read them. She admits she still fantasizes about Abelard during Mass. She says she became a nun not because God called her, but because Abelard told her to. She writes about pleasure and desire and regret without shame. In an age when women were supposed to be mysterious and silent, Heloise was transparent, brutally, beautifully transparent. That honesty changed everything. Before Heloise, romantic love in literature was mostly about men pining for distant, idealized women. Knights worshipping ladies they barely knew. Courtly love, but one-sided. Heloise's letters showed the world what it looked like when a woman loved back fully, with her whole self. When she spoke her own desire, instead of just being the object of someone else's. She made love a conversation, not a monologue, and that brings me to us, to now. How many of us have been in relationships where we pretended to be someone else, where we kept our real thoughts quiet because they might be inconvenient or challenging or uncomfortable? How often do we edit ourselves down to what we think other people want to hear? Heloise shows us a different way. She shows us what it looks like to love someone with your whole complicated, authentic self. But here's the thing about speaking your truth. It costs something. Heloise paid for her honesty. She lived separated from the man she loved. She spent decades in a convent, following rules she didn't choose. She was judged by history, called scandalous, called a bad example. Even today, some people read her letters and think she should have just moved on, found God, gotten over it. But she didn't. And we're still talking about her. She chose love over approval. She chose authenticity over safety. She chose to be remembered as complicated rather than forgotten as perfect. Those are hard choices. They're choices most people don't make because the price feels too high. But Heloise made them anyway. She decided her truth mattered more than what other people thought of her truth. That takes a kind of courage that honestly, I'm not sure I would have. Her intellectual courage was just as radical as her emotional honesty. When Abelard tried to tell her their love was sinful and she should repent, she argued back. She used philosophy and theology to challenge him. She said intention mattered more than action. If she loved him purely, how could that be evil? She took the tools men had used to silence women and turned them into weapons for her own voice. Brilliant. Their story literally changed how Western culture thinks about romantic relationships. Before Abelard and Heloise, love was mostly about marriage arrangements and family alliances. After their letters became famous, love became about two minds meeting, about passion and partnership, about choosing someone because of who they are, not what they can give you. The idea of marrying for love instead of duty. That starts partly with Heloise's letters. So what can we learn from her? Maybe that authenticity is always risky, but never meaningless. That speaking your truth might make people uncomfortable, but silence makes you disappear. That love without honesty isn't really love, it's just performance. Heloise loved Abelard enough to tell him the truth, even when that truth was inconvenient, even when it challenged him, even when it made her look imperfect. That's the kind of love that lasts. She also teaches us that vulnerability and strength aren't opposites. Heloise admits her weaknesses, her ongoing desires, her doubts about God, her resentment about choices that were made for her. But those admissions don't make her weak. They make her human. They make her real. They make her someone we can still understand and admire 900 years later. Perfect people are forgettable. Honest people are eternal. Their love story survived because it was complicated, because it involved real people making difficult choices in impossible circumstances, because neither of them pretended to be something they weren't. Abelard could have written generic love poetry. Heloise could have written pious letters about finding peace in God. Instead, they wrote about desire and regret and intellectual connection and the messy reality of loving someone when the whole world says you shouldn't. That messiness is what makes it beautiful. As you think about your own life, your own relationships, your own moments when you had to choose between truth and safety, remember Heloise. She shows us that speaking your truth might be costly, but silence costs more. That love without authenticity is just pretending. That sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply refuse to lie about who you are and what you feel, even when, especially when, everyone expects you to. Heloise d'Argentel died in 1164, but her voice never stopped speaking. Every time someone chooses honesty over approval, every time someone loves with their whole complicated self, every time someone refuses to be silenced, that's Heloise's legacy. She proved that love and truth together are stronger than any force that tries to separate them. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most important thing any of us can learn. Good night, sleep well, and dream of having the courage to love like that. Eternal embers, the romance that changed history. Their bodies rest together in Père Lachaise cemetery. After 800 years, lovers still leave flowers at their tomb. But here's what gets me about Abelard and Heloise. Their story didn't just survive because it was scandalous. It survived because it changed everything. How we think about love, how we talk about desire, how we understand what it means to choose passion over safety. They gave us the language we still use today when we fall in love. Think about every love letter you've ever read, every romantic movie, every song about wanting someone so desperately it hurts. That emotional vocabulary, it starts with Heloise's letters. Before her, romantic literature was mostly about knights rescuing damsels, heroes conquering women like they'd conquer castles. But Heloise wrote about love as an intellectual and spiritual partnership. She demanded to be seen as an equal. She refused to be saved or conquered. She just wanted to be loved for her mind. The concept of courtly love that dominated medieval culture, the idea that romantic passion could coexist with spiritual devotion, that comes directly from their correspondence. Writers across Europe started copying their style. The raw honesty, the philosophical depth, the refusal to pretend that desire was simple or shameful. Chrétien de Troyes built entire epics around their model of love. Chaucer borrowed their emotional complexity. Even Petrarch's sonnets echo Heloise's voice. They literally taught Europe how to love. But what's even more revolutionary, Heloise proved that women could be philosophers, not just muses or inspirations, actual thinkers. Her arguments about ethics and intention influenced Abelard's masterwork on moral philosophy. Medieval universities started debating her ideas, not her beauty, not her tragedy, her actual intellectual contributions. In an age when most women couldn't even read, Heloise was shaping how scholars understood right and wrong. She forced an entire culture to take women's minds seriously. The religious reforms she implemented at the Paraclete changed how convents operated for centuries. She wrote rules specifically designed for women's communities. She argued that female monasticism shouldn't just copy male traditions. Women had different needs, different strengths, different ways of serving God. Abbesses across Europe started adopting her innovations. She essentially created a blueprint for women's religious leadership that lasted well into the Renaissance. Not bad for someone most people remember only as a tragic lover. Here's what gives me chills. Heloise's letters contain some of the earliest feminist arguments in Western literature. 800 years before the word feminism existed, she was demanding agency, refusing to be silenced, insisting on her right to define her own experience. When Abelard tried to tell her how she should feel about their past, she basically said, "No, you don't get to rewrite my story, my desire, my choices, my truth." That kind of intellectual courage was almost unthinkable for a medieval woman. Their influence spread far beyond literature and philosophy. Legal scholars started debating questions of consent and agency in marriage contracts. Theologians grappled with the relationship between human love and divine love. Artists began depicting women as complex individuals rather than symbols. The entire cultural conversation around relationships shifted. Marriage evolved from a purely economic arrangement to something that might include emotional and intellectual partnership. They helped invent the idea that love could be a meeting of equals. When you read Shakespeare's sonnets, when you watch a romantic comedy, when you send a text that says, "I love you for your mind," you're speaking a language Heloise helped create. The idea that true love means being seen and understood completely, that vulnerability is strength, that passion and intellect can fuel each other. These weren't obvious concepts in the 12th century. They had to be invented, fought for, defended in letters that could have gotten both of them excommunicated. The tragic beauty of their story is that it was built on impossible choices. Abelard chose philosophy over safety when he seduced his student. Heloise chose honesty over convenience when she opposed their marriage. Both chose love over the easy path and paid devastating prices. But those choices created something that outlasted empires. Their willingness to risk everything for authentic connection gave us a new way to think about what human relationships could be. They showed us that love could be transformative. Modern psychologists still study their letters when researching attachment theory and emotional intimacy. Literary scholars analyze Heloise's rhetoric as a masterclass in persuasive writing. Philosophers debate whether their relationship proves that desire and spirituality are compatible or contradictory. Historians use their correspondence to understand medieval women's lives and thoughts. 8 centuries later, they're still teaching us, still challenging our assumptions about love, power, agency, and what it means to be fully human. What moves me most is how their story validates every person who's ever felt like their love was too intense, too complicated, too much for the world to handle. Heloise refused to apologize for loving completely, even when it cost her everything, even when it defied every social expectation, even when it made others uncomfortable. She owned her feelings without shame. That kind of emotional courage is rare in any century. It's what makes their story immortal. They proved that love stories don't have to end with happily ever after to be meaningful. Sometimes the greatest love stories are about people who choose each other repeatedly, even when life tears them apart, even when society punishes them, even when they can only connect through letters. Abelard and Heloise kept choosing each other across decades and distance. They maintained intellectual and emotional intimacy despite impossible circumstances. That's a different kind of happy ending. Their legacy lives in every relationship, where partners challenge each other's thinking. Every couple who debates philosophy over dinner. Every marriage built on intellectual respect as much as physical attraction. Every woman who refuses to diminish herself to make others comfortable. Every man who supports his partner's ambitions even when they eclipse his own. Abelard and Heloise showed us that love could be a laboratory for becoming your best self. The questions they raised still haunt us. How do we balance personal desires with social responsibilities? When is it worth risking everything for love? Can passion and reason coexist? What do we owe to people who shape us intellectually and emotionally? How do we maintain our individual identity within intimate partnerships? These aren't medieval problems. They're human problems. And Heloise's letters offer insights that feel startlingly contemporary even today. Here's what I think their story really teaches us. That love isn't just an emotion. It's an act of imagination. The ability to see someone completely and love them anyway. The courage to be seen completely and trust that you're worthy of love anyway. Heloise imagined a world where women could be philosophers, where desire could be sacred, where love could survive anything. That imagination became reality because she refused to stop believing in it. So when you visit their tomb in Paris and see fresh flowers left by strangers, remember this. You're not just honouring 2 people who loved each other. You're honouring everyone who ever chose vulnerability over safety, truth over convenience, growth over comfort. Abelard and Heloise didn't just fall in love. They fell into a new way of being human, and 8 centuries later, we're still learning from their courage. Some flames burn forever,